A quick word before we start. How is it possible to do the what not to do drawing? To draw something which really does represent what a lot of people might be doing when they draw and isn't just an obviously bad drawing to make the good drawing look better. What I do is I look online for a number of drawings of the same sort of subject. I find 3 or 4 examples which I think really represent the problems I want to look at. And I print off copies and I have them just out of camera range. And as I draw, I keep referencing them to make sure I copy the sort of approach to drawing that they embody. So let's look at this drawing again a bit slower, shall we? The drawing starts happily enough. But right from the word go, the perspective angles are not carefully observed enough. And this line for the top of this roof is more horizontal than sloping at the admittedly slight angle that it has in life. The next big problem with careless lines comes with this stone wall. Instead of observing what's really there, including the perspective lines of the stone rows, I've just started to draw a pattern for stones all over, all the way down. And then I do the same thing for the foliage on the left-hand side. I do a pattern for the leaves rather than trying to work out exactly what's happening. Now above this stonework, I have some dressed stone blocks. But again, I look at my drawing and my reference and I go, right, that looks like this. And so now I create this pattern that I put on pretty much all the stonework, because that's what stonework looks like, instead of looking to see what the particular stonework looks like, particularly the perspective lines that the rows of brickwork create. Again, I see there's a building up here and I draw it in, but I'm not careful enough with my perspective angle lines and they're not nearly steep enough, even though it approximately looks right. Again, I think, well, there's stonework here, so I've got to put my stonework lines on. Again, these lines don't follow the proper perspective angle. And I tend to make them all look the same, because when I have a stone wall now, instead of carefully observing my reference and then my line work, I'm thinking, oh, this is more of that, and that looks like this. And so by thinking that I know what that is, I don't actually observe it or draw it as carefully. And again, I get a pattern for the tiles on top of this roof that's closest to us, and then it's more stonework, which is more of this grid shape lines. So now I'm onto the building next to the main one. Now this angles away, but again, I'm very quick with my lines and I don't realize that even though I've angled it more than the first building, I haven't angled it nearly enough, which means it looks a lot closer to us than it should. It's not sloping away as steeply as it should. And now with this tree, again, branches, so I put some branches in. I'm not really observing the actual branches very carefully because I think I know what branches look like. And now I've got this pattern for leaves that I began to use before. And so I'm doing more of that. And it's a bit like a tangle of wool all over the place. And I get a pattern for the bricks on the chimneys. And I just put those on all the chimneys because that's what brick chimneys look like. And so now I just work on this final building. And again, I've got this sense of, with windows, you basically just do dark coloured in squares. And so I do that without really taking into account how dark the shadows behind the windows really are. I make them all look the same because I'm not being careful enough with my lines to see that some of them should be lighter and further apart to create a lighter effect. And so I just fill in a few details and there's my drawing. What do you think of it? So before I have another attempt drawing this same scene with more careful lines, what overall comments can we make? I would say the overall effect is one of pattern. That before we really see buildings, we see a lot of pattern punctuated by the dark squares of windows. Although fortunately, we have the silhouette of chimneys, which is visually a very strong signal that this is buildings, just to help us get it in the right place in our head. So we're really seeing a focus on lots and lots of line work rather than seeing the shapes that the lines are meant to be creating. Overall, there's little contrast really, with the exception of the dark spaces behind the windows. The hatching isn't really strong enough to make as significant a difference in our drawing as it in fact makes in certainly parts of the reference. And overall, our scene is very flat. It's very flat in terms of directly in front, and it's very flat in terms of to the sides. And the reason for this is we haven't taken the care to draw our perspective lines the way they really are in the reference photo. All of them basically are too shallow. So this line here is almost horizontal for us, whereas in the photo it clearly slopes down. When we come to this line here, we can see the angle is this. When we come to the drawing, we can see that it's a lot less. This angle here, we can see is a lot less than what it should be. It's even more pronounced if we come to this building on the right hand side of our picture. We can see in fact that our perspective line is hugely out. And equally, the lines that our windows follow are also out. If we look at this wall here, the lines of stonework still give us the perspective angles, and again we can see that there's an angle in life which is not represented. Personally, I always find it's the angles of perspective which are a major contributor to the visual drama of a scene. And therefore, when we lessen the angles, we lessen the visual drama, lessen the overall interest of our scene, because the angles produce contrast. So let's make another effort with drawing this. We're showing a little more care with our lines. And it will be the sort of care that starts with more careful observation of what it is we're trying to draw, and then more frequent observation of what we're trying to draw. Lots more glancing back and forth, less thinking, oh yes, I've seen enough, I can now draw all of this. So how does it look to draw being more careful with our line work? I start in the same place, I draw the same elements in the same order pretty much. But I use my pen to carefully measure all the perspective angles, which is what I do normally when I draw. I start with the stonework, with the stone that's most prominent and closest to us. I draw it in much more detail, but the further away from that focal point of stonework I become in my drawing, I draw the stones with a lighter touch, with much less emphasis than I do in that closest point. On the other hand, compared to my first drawing, when I do shade and shadow, I do a lot more lines and I make it a lot darker because I want to create a stronger tonal contrast than I did in the first drawing. As I start to move away from my starting point, particularly with the stonework, I have to pay real attention to make sure I do draw it with a lighter touch, because having just drawn all of the stonework as this grid pattern in my other drawing, I find that I'm wanting to draw too much of it. I also don't just represent the stone blocks in these buildings through lines. I also represent them through tone, because I notice that in fact some of them are darker than others, and that creates visually a lot more interest than just drawing them through lines. I measure all these angles really carefully, particularly these most extreme ones I might measure a few times. And then again, I'm being much lighter in my drawing of the stone blocks. I also notice that the shading and the shadow is a lot darker the lower down in the picture we are. And so when I start to draw shadow and shade in these upper parts, I do them with a lighter touch. I don't press as heavily, my lines are a little bit further apart, and there aren't as many of them. And this reflects the fact, I think, that there's more light bouncing around the higher up we go. Whereas lower down, we want to really get the drama of the contrast between the dark shadows and the sunlit areas, because they also, as well as just looking great, they also outline the buildings for us and create the shapes and the three-dimensionality as well. And so now I'm doing more of the suggesting of the stone blocks and, as I said, colouring some of them in and drawing the gaps between them with lines, and sometimes with one line, but a few of them actually put in the double lines between the blocks for those that are closest to us. With these further windows at an angle, I create a lighter touch by doing the shadow behind the windows much more lightly to give a sense of them being further away and angled away. And with the hatching on these branches, I try and reflect the round shape of the branch as I do it. And I think it's a much happier outcome. We can see a side-by-side comparison of the overall effect of the line work in the first drawing as opposed to the line work in the second drawing. And the fact that there is much more of a three-dimensional feel by both establishing the extremes of the perspective, which actually tell us that these buildings curve away from us quite steeply, and that we're seeing these buildings at a certain angle, even with an element of looking up perspective, and by resisting the urge to create a pattern that represents stonework or leaves or rock work or even shadow and shade, and instead seeking to draw the effect that we see in our reference photo, we get a much more realistic effect by varying our line work a lot more, with having lighter lines and at times broken lines to reflect uneven or broken surfaces, and by seeking to vary the effects of shade and shadow and the way we try and create it, whether it's actually in the shade of the buildings or whether it's the shaded space behind the windows. By being a lot more careful with our observation and then with our line work, and by resisting the temptation to create a pattern and then think that will apply wherever that surface texture is in our drawing, we end up with a much more realistic drawing. And it does take longer to draw in this way because I'm looking back and forth my reference photo a lot more. Ironically, to do a better drawing, I spend a lot more time not actually drawing at all, but instead observing my reference photo more carefully and making deliberate choices with my line work. G'day, I'm Travers. If you haven't already subscribed, why don't you? And hit that notification button so that you know when I do upload a new video. And if you have any thoughts of topics that you'd like me to make a video on, please leave it in the comments. But don't just say perspective, that's a huge topic. What in particular about perspective would you like a video on? And if you're wondering, this drawing took me about 40 minutes to draw in real life, whereas this one took about an hour and a quarter. Careful line work does take more time. Careful observation does take more time. And as I said, to produce a better drawing, we can spend a whole lot more time not actually drawing, instead analysing our reference and thinking hard about what line work will create the effect that we want. If you're wondering where that beautiful scene was, it's this charming English seaside town called Robin Hood Bay. And if you're in the UK at all, it's worth making the effort to get there if you've never seen it. If you recognise some of the things I've talked about in this video, that perhaps sometimes you draw patterns to represent certain textures rather than actually working to draw the effect of the texture that's in the reference, maybe you can give that a focus in your next drawing. Whatever you do and however you do it, have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.